Here.
The topic of discussion this evening is a presentation by Chris Spencer to the HRC for dealing with a presentation, abandonment to demolition, that we will be discussing and is dear to all our hearts, and a topic for discussion. We will have Chris run through the presentation and then open it up to discussion by the HRC members. After we have concluded our discussion, we can open it up for public comments. I would request that public comments be kept to a limited nature and address the topic at hand. I would suggest that we establish a time limit for that public comments, just so we don't go off the rails here and stay up all night watching Zoom here. I would, and I think to respect everyone's time and make the most effective utilization of this technology, limiting it to 3 minutes would be in everyone's interest, including the commenter. So I would entertain a motion from the commission to invite public comment, but that we would request that it be limited to 3 minutes, and we'll appoint Aaron as the timekeeper.
Sounds good.
And if you could make a motion and identify yourself and make a motion, that would be appreciated.
I make a motion that we limit spectators' comments.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I second that.
Okay, all those in favor signify by, I guess, waving.
I think there's a way you can actually wave your hand. Oh, maybe not, unless it's.
It's hard for those on the phone to wave their hand, so I'll do a roll call. Chris Hacker?
Aye.
Aaron Tobin?
Aye.
Lee Pinckney? Lee?
Yes, I said aye.
Oh, I'm sorry. Marilyn Kaplan?
Aye. Aye.
And Jen Garrity?
Aye.
Okay, the motion is carried, and we will move forward with the presentation. So I would turn it over to Chris Spencer to walk us through the presentation and the slide deck that was prepared.
Okay.
Oh,
Aaron, I'm just going to introduce the people here with me before we share the screen.
or can I just real quick? I'm going to mute all of the HRC members for the duration of the presentation, just so that there's no background noise, and we'll save any discussion or questions till the end of the presentation. So I just want to, we'll all mute everybody, unmute everyone at the end, but for the duration, everyone will be muted. So,
Okay.
okay. Okay, go ahead, Chris.
All right, so with me is all the way to the right of your screen. If you can look, that's Rick LaJoy. He's the Director of Building and Regulatory Compliance. So he is the one who is charged with maintaining the buildings, or not doing the work, but making sure that people are complying with all of our regulations when it comes to building codes. And on the left is Russ Reeves. He is one of the third-party engineers that we use when it comes to emergency action on many of these buildings. And with him is Barb Tozy, his assistant. That's way of putting it. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen now. Aaron, do I have to do that? Okay.
It's already full screen and shared, Chris.
Oh, it is. Okay. I'm just going to try to get back to the presentation here. Sorry. Okay. Is it still there?
Yes.
Aaron?
Yes.
Okay. All right. We want to make sure we're set. So we're going to go through a lot of what the process is for demolition, but really what we want to talk about too is how we get to demolition, and why that becomes one of the necessary things that happens. It's an unfortunate thing, but there are a lot of steps that happen before that, and there are a lot of interventions that are happening that are keeping a lot of buildings within the city of Albany from going that route. But what we're trying to do, and we're constantly changing regulations, looking for new tools, is to really break that cycle so we can get these buildings in better hands and into hands of responsible owners who will actually do that. Because really the cause of many of these demolitions is the fact that people are not maintaining their properties. So it's, these are privately owned properties for the most part, and it's the responsibility of the property owner to maintain their property. Aaron, I'm having a little trouble forwarding.
Uh-oh.
It's kind of locked up.
Let's see. Chris, maybe try exiting.
Yeah. Trying to escape. And it's not. Okay, guess it's working now. So we're going to talk a little bit about the process today. Talk about some demolitions, some stabilization, and then really talk at the end some of the recent changes we've been making to try to keep a lot of these buildings from going in that direction, and then some of the roadblocks that we face and some of the things that make it more difficult for the city to do the job that we're trying to do. And then really we want to talk at large to the preservation community and talk about where we really need the help from people out there. So I'm going to start with this. And Rick is going to cover this a little bit, but this is really the emergency process. And we're going to start really from when a complaint is received. And Rick is going to kind of walk through where those complaints come from, first of all. So Rick, go ahead.
So this all starts initially from some sort of a notification that we will receive. So it may be another department in the city notifying us about a potential hazardous building. Could be a neighbor, could be the C-Click Fix platform, could be a 911 call. But either way, we get a call that there's something suspect about a building, and we dispatch an inspector to the scene. Once the inspector is there, they're kind of doing an initial assessment to see, why they were called there, what the status of the property is. If they feel that the condition of the building that they come upon is beyond the scope of what they can handle, it's going to be more than just citing someone a violation. Might be an active collapse or a foundation, laying in the sidewalk. They will kick that up to calling in a supervisor. So almost always it's myself, but it could be my deputy as well. We'll come out to the scene to, again, verify, what's going on with the building. And if we feel that, some sort of emergency action is going to have to happen, whether it's a demolition or a stabilization, we call in our third-party engineer. That third-party engineer comes out to inspect the structure. They're looking for signs of major structural failure or compromise. Something's wrong with the building. Again, we might open the front door and the roof is in the basement, which quite honestly is a high percentage of these buildings. Once it's determined that an emergency action has to happen, whether it's stabilization or a demolition. My staff will then call in the qualified contractors that are on a bidding list that can, do the work. And we will, go over the scope of work with them, with the engineer. They will bid on the work. It's read in the open. I collect them, read them aloud. The low bid wins the project and continues. From the time that it's determined that this has to happen and the bids are awarded, we have 24 hours to be actively working on the project. So whether it's the demolition or the stabilization, we have Department of Labor guidelines that dictate what happens and how it happens.
Yeah, and again, part of that also requires the city to be on site, and it's not like the city can sort of barricade it and walk away. So we've got to have eyes on it until it is the contractor's site.
Yeah, well, and actually, I have to have staff on site until the hazard is eliminated.
Right.
So if it takes 3 days for that work to happen to where it's now made safe and the public is not at risk, that's when my staff will pull out of there. But we are there for incident command and to keep scene safety of the area so people aren't trying to get in and gain access. The contractors own the physical site, so they keep scene safety from within their barricades or tape or whatever barricades, fencing they may have up.
Great, thanks. So I want to talk a little bit about what a structural engineer does. I'm sure some of you that are architects understand this to some degree. A lot of people have a little bit of a misconception how this process works. So when the structural engineer is looking at these buildings, they're not just looking at the building and sort of nodding their head and saying, yep, this building has to come down. They're using a lot of their critical skills that they've learned in part of their licensing and their professionalism in making those determinations. So really a lot of the critical skills that you'll find in a structural engineer is this in-depth understanding of the physics and mathematics involved in materials and keeping a building standing up straight and making sure that that is safe. It's an understanding of all the properties of the various materials, their density, the hardness, tensile strength, and the bending strength, and really understanding how those materials operate under different types of stress. So, when a building is constructed properly and it hasn't aged and none of the materials are compromised, it's, all of the materials are operating the way they should be. But once different parts of that system start getting compromised, everything else is under stress. So that's what the structural engineer has to really understand. You have to be able to calculate all these materials, how they're going to perform under these stresses, whether it's compression or tension or any of the other kinds of forces that are acting on it, and then have to predict how these materials are going to perform over a period of time. It's one thing for the materials to be performing today, but how's it going to be working in 2 or 3 years? If there's already been some sort of compromise. So, and much different than a structural engineer that is really just designing buildings or designing loads and things like this, there is the historic materials. You're not going to find a lookup chart for the carrying capacity of an old growth timber frame beam in the middle of a basement or something like that, or how the actual piles are working within these buildings. So the structural engineer really has to understand these historic materials, how to calculate them and compensate for the degradation of the materials and these systems over time. Because once they degrade, you have to look at what other systems might be able to carry something that one beam was maybe carrying, or what are the other interventions that could happen to make sure that that building can either stay in place and be stabilized, or whether there's a determination that it has to come down. So, and what you'll see when there's a stabilization, there's a lot of work that goes into really looking at the building, looking at the geometry, looking at whether the walls are plumb, whether the beams are not under stress, or what are the interventions that are going to happen. And you can see on one of Russ's sheets here, a lot of formulas that I have no idea what they mean, but they look really good. And they're, pretty impressive. But you'll see a lot of in-depth research that goes into any one of the stabilizations that happens within the city or any of these projects. So structural engineers, they're licensed professionals. They put their stamp in liability on the line when they sign off on these building plans. Part of that is also indemnifying the city, making sure that we're not responsible. I think it's important to know that part of what they have to do is they have to, when they go home and sleep, they want to make sure that whoever's in that building or near that building is going to wake up safely. So it's not a matter of just sort of a comfort zone. It's really a matter of doing the calculations correctly, understanding, with a lot of certainty whether that building is going to stay up or whether the stabilization is going to work. And it's not just a stabilization for the building itself or the public, but it's also, when you think about a stabilization, you have to think about the contractors that are going to be in that building, and is it even a safe building to have people in there to work, or is there a safe way to get them in there to work? So in the city of Albany, this is just 2019 data. Rick and his department cited over 2,944 properties within the city. Of those, only 2.3% of those, or 70 of those, actually went all the way to demolition. So there's a huge number in there of properties that they are constantly working on, citing, making sure that there are interventions so they do not get to demolition. Of those that were cited, 2,098 actually complied, and of the rest, 846 are in court. So in court means that there's been fines that have been levied, and then it has to go to court because the people are not complying. One of the difficulties, we'll talk a little bit about it at the end though, is that oftentimes, even once it goes through the court system and a property owner pays the fines, they are not required by the court to then remedy the situation. So then if they do not fix the building, then the process has to start all over again. And it has to be cited again, and it has to go through that whole court procedure again. So that's one of the issues that we're finding. So I've just got to move something out of my way here. I guess I can't. So of the properties that were cited, Aaron, I can't read my own slide.
Can you,
Escape for a second and slide that out of my way?
what are you looking to move?
Well, it's everybody's picture here is.
So if you go up to the top,
Yep.
all the way on the left, there's hide thumbnail video.
At the very top of it.
Yeah, I just can't get that. I'm sorry for 1 second. You see the mouse? Yeah, Aaron, I'm just trying to minimize this.
It's an important screen.
Yeah, hang on. I'm going to escape for 1 second.
Okay.
Nope, that's not helping. Now I'm not able to move it.
You can't get to the tiles at the top there, right?
No, I'm just not able to do that. Okay. All right, so I'm going to try to see what I can see, but of the properties that were cited, obviously 146 were still open or sent to court. Number were deemed to be unsafe, unfit. And so anyway, in the end, some of those were sent to court.
I think that the one that we can't see is it says that they were stabilized. So 9.
Yep, so 9 of those were stabilized. So again, and then 70 of all those 200 and something, 2,000 something properties were demolished. 24 of those were because of fire. 35 of those were already in court. So, and again, it's important to note that, all of these properties are, for the most part, privately owned. So it's the responsibility of the property owner to maintain these properties. The city is trying to get them through the court procedures, trying to cite them, but sometimes people just will not comply. All right, Aaron, I shouldn't have hit escape, so.
It's still full. Still full.
Okay.
To try it.
Sorry about this.
Okay. Um, let's see.
Okay. So, all right. So I want to talk a little bit about the causes of demolition. So, again, there are really, I would say, two primary causes. One is really going to be physics, the other is economics. So when a building is standing the way it was designed to stand, there's usually no issues with it. But the problem comes in when people don't maintain their property. Sometimes this is because of economics. People just can't afford to, but other times they make those economic choices that they're not going to put the money back into it. Oftentimes it can be the other way too, is, we look at a property that may have to be demolished, not necessarily because there is no way to stabilize it, but the cost of doing it is so prohibitive that it just doesn't make any sense. So we really have to think about, when buildings are maintained and all of the systems are operating the way they're supposed to operate and are, all the walls are plumb, there usually are no issues with it. But, once you get water infiltration, things like that, from a lack of maintenance, these buildings tend to deteriorate pretty rapidly. So these are just the basic forces that you'll see that are acting on any building or any building system or material. Compression, so that's really gravity and the weight of what's above a certain building member or in the walls. All the loads the idea is to transfer all the loads down through to the footings. Tension is really the pulling apart. So a lot of the materials are not made for that. Bending is really when you get a sort of lateral force in any one direction. Torsion a lot of times will occur when something is missing, when part of the foundation is missing, and start the whole wall can start to twist. And the shears sometimes will happen when there's quite a force coming in one direction or the other. So what we see often in the city of Albany is masonry construction. Masonry construction is excellent in terms of its compressive strength, and that is about all it has. It's got a little bit of tensile strength when it's probably new and the mortar is pretty good, but as the mortar gets really old, it becomes pretty dried out, and there's very little strength in that. And to make the entire building work, you have to have all of these other things. You have to have a whole framework inside that building so that those masonry walls can withstand some of those other forces. So you've got lateral forces coming in, the weight of the roof coming down, all of those have to be transferred one way or the other. But again, those masonry walls, when they're plumb and everything else is operating, are extremely strong. Once they get compromised, you have a lot of issues with that, because that wall has no strength laterally, it has no shear strength, it has none of the other strengths to resist those forces. A lot of times you'll see the beams in the basement through water infiltration or other issues be compromised to the point of shear failure, where the weight of everything above it will actually crack that beam, and it will have successive failures up through the rest of the house or the building. And obviously we have fires that compromise buildings to a great degree. Sometimes the fires happen and people do work later on in the building and don't actually address some of the issues. Sometimes in the older buildings, you've got joists that are pocketed into the masonry wall, not cut correctly. So when that joist, whether it's a fire or some other failure in the middle of that joist, when that fails, if it's not a fire cut joist and it doesn't have that angle on it, it'll start to put pressure outward on those walls. So those are some of the issues that you see a lot of in the buildings that we deal with all the time. Again, when the force on a beam or on a roof or anything is too great, rather than transferring that load laterally, it puts pressure outward on the exterior walls and can create all sorts of problems. So, we have snowfall here in this area, hopefully not as much as you see in this picture, but oftentimes with an older building, when you have crack beams and things like that, you can have some very catastrophic failure when it comes to the loads that are on top of the building, not just the building materials itself. So again, the fires, this was one of the fires on Sheridan Avenue. So you can see from the front, the building itself looks somewhat intact. But when you look from up top with the picture that Rick LaJoy took from his trusty lift from the fire department ladder, you can see that the entire interior of the building has been compromised. So those are the things that are really difficult to do anything about in terms of stabilization. Oftentimes, when people see the public sees a demolition happening, it could be a building that they go by all the time. They go by this building, like on this one here. This is Emmett Street. And the facade appears to be intact. And you look at the building next door and you think, well, why couldn't somebody just restore that, fix that up and make it just like all the other buildings there? At first glance, that's what it appears to be. But in this case, when that building was opened up, this is what you have. A true open floor plan. So you've got, no roof structure, no wall structure, no floor structure from one floor to the other. So again, what you're seeing from the outside before demolition, and sometimes even before we have our eyes on it, this is the case. So sometimes this is caused, and oftentimes we see a lot of issues related to that center drain on many of these roofs, where that gets clogged and the water continues to go down through on the interior of the house. And oftentimes you don't even see the issues through the roof. So it's all happening internal to the building, and there's no outward signs of it until there's some catastrophic failure. So typically when an engineer comes to the site, we get a report. Some of the engineers will provide sort of a one-page observation along with a bunch of photographs, and this is kind of what we get. Something that says, based on our visual observation during this site visit, it is our opinion that this building is in poor condition and that emergency demolition action is warranted. One of the things that, after going through a lot of these reports that I've been impressed with in the work that Russ is doing, is that he's actually explaining and noting with each photograph what's going on. So these are just I'm going to read a couple snippets from different ones of his reports. Here's one that says, there are multiple collapse zones within the rear half of the building at each floor level, such that the roof has collapsed into the third floor and the third level floor has collapsed into the second floor level in a progressive mode of failure. So you can imagine, the condition in a building like that. This one, the rear half of the first floor is on the verge of a collapse and will induce a rupture in the rear masonry wall. Additional collapse of the remaining floor system due to gross deterioration is considered imminent at this time. So these are time-sensitive things. These are not things where the engineer can look at this and then walk away or just say, it's really not that bad. So another one, portions of the second floor are on the verge of collapse and will cause a partial collapse of the second floor level facade into the city of right-of-way. This is kind of one of our, worst dangers that we can face in terms of public safety, having that facade fall right into the street and, with catastrophic results. Here's another one. It shall be noted that the collapse of the easterly 1/3 of the masonry exterior bearing wall and the adjacent structure is considered imminent at this time. A further progressive collapse of the third, second, and first floor levels and rear upper half of the masonry wall is also considered imminent at this time, which is creating a significant public safety hazard. And here's one where they talk a little bit about the cracks. So because of the fracture cracks on the members, due to the horizontal shear stress, these members are unable to continue to support the dead weight of the second floor level, which has induced this framing into dynamic failure. And typically they end with this: the present condition of the building is considered a high hazard to public safety and shall be removed as soon as practicable under the City of Albany's emergency condemnation procedures. So when you read a lot of these reports that Russ has done in particular, you'll be able to sort of read a little bit of the story of what happened to the structure of that building and why that building has to come down. It's not just a sort of overall judgment call that the building is in poor shape and should come down. So here's another, one of these reports, and you'll see a little bit. Rick, do you want to talk a little bit about this particular project? I think this was a land bank project.
Sure. Yep. So this particular building was owned by the land bank. They, notified us that there were some floor collapse inside. We met their engineer on scene. And quite frankly, this is the only time in my tenure where I was going to override the engineer and use our given authority to do a demolition, because they didn't feel, you know, what his statement to me was, well, I don't know if it's going to fall today. And unfortunately, once we're notified and we're there, we don't have the luxury of walking away, you know, with a crapshoot saying, well, it might not fall today. If we were to walk off that scene and something were to happen, we're on the hook because we knew about the condition. This was next to an occupied structure, probably 3 or 4 feet away. And it clearly had severe issues. So he reevaluated it and understood, you know, the essence of what an emergency is as it relates to the city, you know, being on scene versus a planned demolition where, you know, they may feel they have some, you know, real ample time to go through the demolition process, go in front of, you know, whatever means they have to go through to do that. This certainly was not that, didn't meet that criteria. This needed to happen. And even with the pictures, as devastating as they look, until you're inside of one of these things and you can, you know, feel the dampness, you can see the saturation, you can put your foot through the floor just by stepping inside. You know, pictures don't do it justice. You know, these buildings are very hazardous to the public, and as a recipient of a traumatic head injury from one of these buildings, I can tell you, I'm not willing to gamble on life safety. So.
And I think certainly anybody who owns a property on either side of a property like this would not appreciate it if the city was going to walk away from a building in this condition once it was found to be in this state. So not only is it dangerous, it's completely irresponsible to walk away from a building like this and not address the issues. So this is just a little bit of one of Russ's reports, but you can see again here on this building, this is 4 Delaware Street. You can see the building from the front looks entirely intact. It looks pretty decent, but from the roof, you can see that there is almost no roof in photograph 3 there. The entire interior of the structure was compromised. The main bearing beams were all compromised. And again, you're starting to get a twisting motion from this particular building. And so this is a lot. I'm going to ask Russ to walk through this, because this was one of the properties that we looked at and we're really looking hard to try to stabilize. This is 159-161 Eagle. And I'm going to just sort of put up a lot of the drawings and let him sort of talk through the process, because we spent a lot of time and effort in trying to come up with a stabilization plan, and even bringing all the contractors here to our building to do a PowerPoint so we could safely walk them through the building and show them what the stabilization plan was going to be. So go ahead, Russ, if you want to talk a little bit about this one.
Yes.
You probably have to talk a little louder.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Everyone hear me okay?
Aaron?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. This building, 159 to 161, these were brick buildings. Each one was very heavily damaged, heavily water damaged. Large portions of the floor system have failed, but we developed a methodology to put in a skeletal steel frame into the building. And that skeletal steel frame served several purposes. It actually was able to restrain the brick bearing walls, the exterior brick bearing walls.
And again, this is in theory, if
Yeah.
we were able to go that far.
That's right. And not only it not only would restrain the perimeter brick bearing walls, but also allowed us to insert a new skeletal framing system. And what you see here is some of the foundation treatment we used. The drawing to the left showed some of the steel columns that we were putting in, along with threaded rod that allowed us to restrain the outer wall. To the right was the footing we used here, along with the reinforcing schedule for the contractor. We explain everything A to Z for the contractor, so he has an understanding of the reinforcement pattern needed, the length of the rebar, the placement of it. We've developed a special brick masonry wall tie over the years that we utilize, in which it allows us to pick up about 3 feet of the floor joists, and that gives a good development length that allows us to restrain the outside wall properly, picking up a total of 3 fasteners per floor joist, and gets this a very tight configuration, which we've used quite a number of times in building a stabilization through the city of Albany. Now, these brick walls were deformed very badly. And over the years, we developed a rigid steel frame that's braced sufficiently that keeps a brick masonry wall intact. And as Chris was mentioning, quite often the brick masonry that deflects, is deformed. It doesn't really have the tensile strength because of the nature of the masonry material and the mortar. This braced frame allows the structure to maintain rigidity through transferring the loads through this frame that you see. And that's what we've been able to develop and had pretty good success with it. And then and that's shown in the left side, elevation view. The right shows this configuration in plan view. And again, we try to be very explanative. We provide as much detail as we can to the contractor, and so that it helps him to assemble this correctly. And then this was the framing that was utilized to the back of the structure. Now, this
That's it. So you can back up.
this particular building, 161, 159. This was very hard to control. There was a lot of groundwater migration, and over about a month's duration, maybe 3 weeks, the exterior perimeter, the exterior bearing walls destabilized. And as a matter of fact, it went into dynamic failure because a lot of groundwater migration from uphill areas, and so we weren't able to do that just because of it was remarkable the progression that the exterior bearing walls took.
And Rick, do you want to talk a little bit on that project in particular about the cost as well, and how that is affected in terms of stabilization versus demolition from the county perspective?
Right. So often these demolitions are, they're always built to an owner, and essentially the owner doesn't pay it, so it goes on their taxes. We pay the contractors through the city, and then the county reimburses us and then take the property through foreclosure. This particular property, we knew the significance of it. The intent was to save it. We developed this scheme, and we notified the county to let them know what was going to happen, that we wanted to save it. And their direction to us was no, that they were not going to pay it, that if the cost of a demolition exceeded the cost of stabilization, or vice versa, if the stabilization cost more than the demolition, that we were tasked with having to do the demolition. We pushed back. I mean, this particular building, there was a lot of pushback. I mean, I all but begged to save one of the structures, kind of sacrificed the other one. They were giving us a lot of pushback, and quite frankly, ultimately, at the same time, we got a really bad snowstorm. And when we went there, my intention was I was still going to save a building and sacrifice the one. And then literally within a matter of 2 days, the building rolled about 6 inches off its foundation and it was about to collapse. So we ended up losing both because, the timing was just such that, even if we had tried to stabilize it, that building was moving on its own, so
Yeah,
a lot of
so-
times we don't have it's not our timing, it's the building's timing. We don't always have it's not often we have the ability to be in a building early enough to do these preventions. The catastrophic movements have already happened, almost always before we get there.
Yeah, and so I think at that point, it was not a position we could ask any contractor to go into, and we weren't, I think, 100% sure that because of the dynamic nature that was happening, that some of these efforts were going to be 100% successful as well. So, but I do want to go over one of the recent success stories that we did have in terms of the stabilization. This was 19 2nd Street. So there's the building there. And again, this was one where certainly the stabilization was more than the demolition, but part of our argument on this one in particular was that this building coming down would potentially force a demolition of the one to the left and compromise the one on the right. So we were sort of using a little bit of that, and I think there was a lot of truth in that in terms of trying to figure out how we were going to stabilize this building. And it was a pretty integral building to that block. But again, looking from the outside, this looks like a pretty well intact building. So I'm going to have Russ go through this stabilization monumental effort on this one in particular. So go ahead and click to the next one.
This building, including the basement, was 4 stories in height. The entire interior framing members collapsed from the roof right down to the basement. But 3 of the side walls, the front, the facade, and the 2 side bearing walls were intact. The rear wall was on the verge of collapse. So what we did, we left about 2 feet return of the masonry in the back. They acted as they behaved as a pilaster and gave us some rigidity to the structure. So we had the contractor saw cut, made a vertical saw cut, came in 2 feet, made a vertical saw cut on the west side, vertical saw cut on the east side, and very carefully by hand removed the back of the building. And then he utilized an excavator and drew the debris out. At that point, we entered the building and we instructed him where to saw cut and carefully remove the remaining skeletal framing that had partially collapsed. So we got all that out, and then we started. What you see here is a plan view of the basement framing. We poured strip footings on the easterly and westerly, along the easterly and westerly bearing walls, one towards about 8 feet away, and then we inserted 2x6 stud bearing walls and floor framing. And we worked our way up. You can see some of the footing details. Along the way, as we prepare these drawings, we also calculate large beam sections that we use, micro lambs and so forth. We put our work right, we show our work right on here. We do that because if we have to adjust ourselves in the field, we already show how we arrive numerically at some of the sizing of the structural elements. That helps us if we have to adjust ourselves based on what we find in the field. So we show all our work on each of our designs that we prepare. We show all the engineering on the worksheets as well. And this particular one, we just left the basement and we're up to the first floor level. We had to build some beams to pick up certain areas that were required. This is an elevation view. Excuse me. I'm sorry. This is an elevation view of all 4 stories and how they're going to be restrained. One of the things that was a little tricky is that we had no access to the, sorry about that, I don't know why they did that. We had no access to put in steel plate and threaded rod on the outside of the building. Normally we do that to restrain the exterior walls. So we have a special methodology that we use using 3/4 inch threaded rod and a special epoxy and we have a special framing system that allows us to restrain the exterior masonry walls back to the interior frame that we just created. And that's what we did in this case. You can kind of see, we show, although it might be a little difficult to see, you can see that some of the threaded rod locations that we utilized. Now, when we do these designs, we recognize that in some cases this building will possibly remain vacant for 15, 20 years. So a lot of our designs, we have a longevity, and we seal up the envelope of the structure, make it watertight. The epoxies we use are very resilient. We have a lot of good experience with different types of epoxies, Sika products, and so forth. In this particular case, a lot of our designs follow ASCE, ASCE 7, which is applied loads to structures and buildings and other structures. That's a design guide that we utilize. We utilized it in this case, and we design these members so that there's no heat present. That increases the loads that we have to utilize, because snow can be on the roof longer than it would normally be if it was a heated structure. And that reflects some of the calculations you see here. This particular item shows some of the special framing that was required in certain instances that we encountered in the building, along with the load calculations. We provide venting to the structure to make sure that we get good airflow. We recognize that at some point, this structure is going to be vacant for a period of time, so we ventilate all our buildings that we stabilize. Here we calculate the load capacity of the lowest floor level. This was a load capacity that we calculate for a 2x6 framing. Because this building was so heavy, we have to calculate to make sure all the framing we utilize, especially at the lower level, can take the weights starting from the roof level all the way down. And that's reflective here in these calculations. This is special foundation requirements at the back of the building to accommodate wind loads and how it's framed in. Going up 4 stories, there's quite a bit of wind loads on the back of this building, both in terms of pushing, but also there's a suction load associated with that. And that's reflective here. These are some additional structural anchorages that we utilize for brick walls. And then we have a new EPDM roof section that we show there for the contractor. So that's what was involved in 19 2nd Street. Very substantial stabilization, but we had an opportunity to do that safely, and that's what we were able to do.
So I'm just going to run through some of the pictures of the progress during that construction. So this is what it looked like when we arrived on scene. And there was a staircase, and that was about it. This is partway through the excavation where they were able to brace up the roof enough where there was some roof left and start to remove some of the debris from the back of the house. This is one of those areas where we were lucky enough to have access to the back of the building. I think it would probably not have been a feasible project without that. There's some of the framing starting in the basement level, and that's the back foundation wall all the way to the right. Some of the framing going on. And this was done in 2 phases. So you'll see at the end here.
I just didn't know if you noticed the monitors on the building next to it.
Yeah. So there's some spacings and what do you call them, crack gauges there to look at the movement that's happening. So there was some, when you're facing this building from 2nd Street, the building to your left, it had been moving in one direction. So trying to monitor that to make sure through this process that nothing was getting any worse, and making sure that could be addressed if there was any issues there. But this was really done in 2 phases. The first was really all this interior work. And our intent was to try to get the property owner, once we got to this point where it was stable, to then take on the project, finish the project, get it weather tight, and get it closed up. we were unsuccessful in getting the property owner to do anything, let alone returning certified mail and you know, affidavits and all sorts of stuff that we were sending. So we had to go to a phase 2, mainly because we had to protect the property owners on either side. So if leaving it like this would have, number one, compromised all the work that was done. Number two, it would have allowed water to get into the foundations on the properties on either side and would have pooled up within the basement of this property. There's the back of the building, second floor. Again, the upper part, and there's some of the roof structure going on. So I want to talk, and again, there's the crack gauges, so looking at that deflection, the deflecting wall on 21 2nd Street. So you can see that separation, how it gets wider as you go to the top. So I want to talk a little bit about the costs on this one. So this is really where we end up in, you know, there ends up an economic issue here. So starting with this project, there was, you know, we roll up and there's $10,000 of property that's owned. The estimated cost of the demolition would have been $65,000. So that's kind of a, you know, an easy thing to say, well, that's the easiest thing to do. But again, for the reasons we thought that, you know, demolishing that would have some ramifications to 21 2nd Street, and we wanted to make sure that we're not demolishing 2 buildings. And in this particular case, we want to try to control that, try to save that entire block of buildings by saving this building. So the phase 1 stabilization was $92,600. Phase 2 was $71,400. And really, because this would be typically a 3-unit building, needing all of its mechanicals, electrical, insulation, finishes, all of that, about $200,000 to finish. So all told, about $374,000 by the time you get this project to a finished state where you could rent it out or sell it. So again, you know, the cost of stabilization was about 52% more than the cost of demolition. So, and this is just looking at the assessments of the properties nearby. So 21 2nd Street was assessed at $10,000. This one was assessed at $15,000. 17 was $139. So the highest on this block was $201,500. So from an economic perspective, you think about what had to happen to this property, all the work that went into it, and at the end of the day, you have $374,000 into a project that the highest other building on that block is $200,000, just in terms of the assessment. So you know that is the issue that we face a lot. The economics of this, trying to get not just the spending more on a stabilization than the demolition. The other thing the county and we are all concerned with is doing a stabilization that in 5 years is then going to be a demolition too. So then you have the compound cost of both of those together. So, you know, these are, by the time we get to this position, when an emergency is called, a lot of these buildings have been vacant for 10, 15, 20 years. There's been no maintenance happening on these buildings. They've been ignoring citations that they've been getting. They've been oftentimes ignoring the courts. So, you know, the demolition end of things is really the end of the line. There really is not a lot of options when we get to that point. And again, this is just a real world example of what happens sometimes with the stabilization and how severe the costs can be. And one of the things, you know, we're not in a market like New York City. So here's a row house that just sold, you know, some of these row houses were selling for $1.5, $1.6 million. We don't have that luxury. We're not in a hot market. So again, you know, when you're thinking about a stabilization, even putting $60,000 into a house, into one of these buildings, sometimes can be put it way over the top, because that may be $60,000 to stabilize it, but that's not $60,000 to get that property either ready for sale or ready for occupancy. So, you know, the margins in the city are so tight that it really, you know, you watch a lot of these things on TV where, you know, or you see articles of these buildings that are deteriorated beyond belief, and they're stabilized, they're renovated, and they're turned into just beautiful places. But that has to do with what that end value really is going to be. and what you can absorb in those markets. So this is good. So most of my notes are going to be a little bit off. So the vacant building registry, we're going to talk a little bit about what's been changed this year. And Rick, I'm going to have Rick talk a little bit about the changes he's made in the code to try to make sure that we're getting eyes on these buildings sooner.
Yeah, so the amendment that I drafted last summer and passed through the council was to amend the building registry so that every year when a building is registered, it now requires that owner to allow us to conduct an interior inspection. The inspection is solely looking for structural deficiencies. We're not looking for holes in the sheetrock kind of thing. We're looking to make sure that the roof structure is good, that the windows are intact, the foundation is good, there's no floor collapse. Because oftentimes we're not in these buildings until I get that emergency call. So, my main objective since I became director was getting to the beginning of what leads us up to the emergency demolition so that we're not standing there doing a demolition by neglect. So conducting the interior inspections yearly, and then also it requires the building to have all the utilities terminated. So there's no gas, no electric, no water. When we leave the power on, it invites squatters, which then often end up with them trying to stay warm and they set something on fire. Gas is a no-brainer. The gas shouldn't be on, and the water off, because what happens in a lot of these and almost all of these buildings is what we term urban mining. So people break in, the vandals, they strip it of all the copper, all the water lines, and several buildings will have water running. They literally will rip the meter out and water is flowing. So we won't even know about it until it's either coming out of the basement windows or we get called there for some other emergency. But all that water is just eroding the foundation and creating havoc in the building. So all the utilities have to be terminated and the building has to be watertight. So whether it's windows or boarding of the windows, but probably 90% or better of the emergency demolitions are a result of water infiltration.
Yep.
So trying to get the buildings watertight so that we're not, getting saturation. These buildings are very old, so they're not meant to hold the weight of that much saturation, particularly after floor joists become fractured and roof goes bad. 19 2nd Street, just to give you a quick example. I started with the county in 2013 and was at my very first emergency demolition across the street from there. And at the time, some of the folks that were there, doing the typical argument of why are we tearing it down? And I had a conversation with Sue Holland at the time, and I told her, standing on scene when it's too late does nobody, it's not helping anybody. And I used as an example 19 2nd Street because at the time the county was in possession of it. And I took her for a walk through that very building that you just saw all those pictures. And in 2013, we had a slate roof leak and all the walls were intact, all the plaster was intact. And now we fast forward 5 years, that small roof leak became catastrophic to that building at a cost, that you just seen. So again, our whole intent is being preemptive. It's not about, the demolition and the process once we're there and we have to deal with an emergency. Because quite frankly, at the end of the day, my only concern is life safety. So backing up and trying to get there from the beginning was the foresight and the amendment change.
So the other thing we're doing is we're going to be purchasing a drone so we can get real-time information on these properties, at least on the roof and some of the back areas of the house that are inaccessible. Using Google Earth and satellite view that's 4 years old is really not doing us much good. So we've got to be able to get there, take a look at that, get closer inspections on a lot of these properties as much as we can. But even that, we still have to get those annual inspections. So part of those annual inspections in the interior is what's important, because sometimes the roof will be intact, the building is weather tight, but then if you have a interior gutter downspout that's in the center of the building that is plugged up and you have a building with no heat. Now you've got water, standing water inside one of these standpipes coming all the way down. That breaks open, and now all the water that comes in from the roof from that drain is going right into one of the floors, and it's just gushing all over that building, and it's going to be unnoticed for at least a year until we get an inspection. So, you know, those are some of the things that are really difficult to do just from the exterior, and the exterior is not going to tell you the full story. And by the time something on the interior transmits that story to the outside, it's usually too late. So some of the roadblocks that we have are, again, we talked earlier about the courts not requiring compliance. They just require that you pay the fine. So that becomes a difficult issue, because then the entire process has to begin again. The code violations that happen that we levy, they do not go against the taxes. Unlike the Department of General Services, sometimes when they're doing yard cleanups and some of the other infractions that happen, those get levied against the taxes. So that's something we are looking to do. So we're always trying to see, are there ways we can, accelerate that foreclosure? Because the longer a property takes to get to foreclosure and no work being done on it, the harder it is to get that property in the proper hands before it's to that point. And one of the other things that we find is that, again, a lot of these properties were bought originally through the county auction process. These were oftentimes bought sight unseen. People might have paid $2,000 or $5,000 or whatever for a building. Maybe they came up and looked at it and realized the real estate up here wasn't quite as hot as it is down in Brooklyn or down in New York, and the building needed a lot of work, so they just didn't do anything. Sometimes they didn't pay their taxes, sometimes they did, but at the end of the day, it didn't really matter. And it's a lot different going through tax foreclosure because it does not get reported to a credit bureau. A bank foreclosure, people are a little bit more careful about. They try to avoid that as much as possible, but the tax foreclosure doesn't get reported. So those are things we're looking at to see if, again, those are things that if somebody is facing a foreclosure or they know they're going to be going towards foreclosure from the taxes, they're going to be more willing to rid themselves of that building. So that's really what we're trying to do, is how do we extricate these buildings from owners who either have no capacity, no intention, or no ability to do the work that needs to be done, and how do we get those into other people's hands? So again, those are the legislative changes. So what we're really asking from the preservation community is, as we start looking at these legislative changes, we're going to be looking for support. We're going to be looking for people to call, legislators, representatives of the state, even the city council members when we're doing local ordinances as well. And also to look at what other cities are doing where things are working. What are the legislative changes we could be making that might help this process? Another thing we're always trying to do is figure out what those funding gaps are. So again, if we come across a building that we think is a pretty good candidate for stabilization, and if we stabilize it, we might be able to find an owner, but the stabilization is $40,000 or $60,000 more than the demolition, we can't just okay that, because the county is going to make us whole eventually on the demolition cost, but they're not going to make us whole on going above and beyond that cost of demolition. Because again, what they don't want to do is have us stabilize it only to demolish it in 10 years. So really is, how do we get some funding together? How do we create sort of a fund that can help us on some of those buildings? Also funding for property owners, identifying these property owners that may be having some issues and reaching out to them to talk about what are some of the programs that are out there that might help them pay for some of the work that they're doing, the tax credit project programs and things like that. So again, helping us to continue to get the legislative changes to accelerate the foreclosure process. And really, I think the number one thing really is, we've got 1,000 buildings on the vacant building registry. Every one of those on our website, you can look it up through our app geo or through our property viewers. You can find out what the billing address is of that owner. Sometimes it's an LLC, sometimes it's an actual person. But really trying to identify these property owners, reaching out to them, and seeing if you can line up some buyers or somebody who might be interested in actually taking that property, trying to convince these property owners, even some of them are maybe paying their taxes just because they use it as a write-off, but really convincing these property owners that rather than wait and wait and wait until the property falls down or gets taken through foreclosure, to transfer that property, to get it into the hands of somebody who would be willing to actually do the work, somebody who could bring that property to a productive use and really restore that in a way that they deserve to be restored to. So those are things that we can't do. We don't have the capacity to do some of those things, but there is a huge army of preservationists out there. That's really where we need the help. We don't need it really standing on the curb at the site of a demolition, because at that point it's already too late. And again, we're trying to change the process, trying to change the cycle as much as we can. So I think that is the last of my slides. So Aaron, if you want to go ahead and take questions. Do you want me to unshare my screen, or what do you want me to do on my end?
I think I should be able.
I was trying to give you a less depressing picture at the end to look at. So
everyone is unmuted and has the ability to talk.
Do you have the ability to just have people raise hands or not? I guess not. That's all right.
Yeah, right now I'm.
Well, I'd like to thank the city for giving us a blow-by-blow analysis of what they go through dealing with buildings that need to come down or thought about coming down. I truly appreciate that. It's opened my eyes a little bit more.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No, I appreciate the presentation and the thoughts, and going back to one of the first slides, where do we need your help? I think that's where, looking at the vacant building registry and being advocates for early intervention, so that we don't have to face the prospect of demolition by neglect or demolition because an owner is intransigent about doing anything. I would be interested to hear some of your experiences with the land bank. I know there was a demolition recently of a land bank property, an emergency demolition. It was a bit of a surprise. We would not have expected that with them being stewards of their buildings, but
yeah, I think, I'll talk a little bit and then I'll let Rick talk a little bit on this as well. Again, the land bank I think they've tried to triage their properties. They usually go through and they inspect all the properties. And again, they try to look at it, whether it's a candidate for demolition, whether it's one they think is stabilization, or whether it's a property they think they can put right on the market. There are a lot of properties that they're getting, and it's the Albany County Land Bank, so they are scattered around Albany County. The majority are in the city of Albany, and they maintain the frontage of each one of these properties. So they have contracts for people to do snow plowing, to do snow removal, to cut grass, to do all of those kinds of things. And then they have to insure each one of these properties. So they have a tremendous amount on their plate in general. And again, these properties are right now, especially the first two phases that they got for the county, these are the worst of the worst. These are the properties that have been abandoned for many, many years, that have gone through this lengthy process of just a complete lack of any work being done. And I think in some cases, they've done these interior inspections. And just like we've seen in some of these other buildings, these deteriorating properties can change pretty rapidly if there are situations that aren't recognized. So, I'm not, obviously these things happen and they try to avoid them. They know what the demolition process is. They would much rather go that way because the prices, frankly, are better if they're doing, if they're able to bid it out versus doing it under an emergency. So I don't think they seek to do anything that way, but it, does happen. And I think a lot of this is also a learning curve for them as well. And I'm going to let Rick speak a little bit to them about the land bank and their process as well.
Yeah. So before I came to work for the city, I worked for the county before the land bank was an entity. And I was tasked with, I worked through the foreclosure process. So I was inside of every building that the county owned on a weekly basis. So many of the buildings that we're seeing the land bank get currently were actually buildings I was in back in 2013, 14, part of 15. So they're getting, you know, the city as a whole has been really proactive in the last 5 years. Prior to that, I don't know that it was ever as aggressive as it is. So a lot of the stock of the buildings that they're being handed have been, you know, sitting in that cycle of being sold at the auction and then getting taken again through foreclosure and then selling it again, et cetera. So a lot of those buildings have been vacant 20, even 30 years sometimes. So the buildings they're receiving are in pretty dire shape, you know, often. So I think you're kind of seeing their demolitions, the ones that they're going through, are really because they're kind of left holding the bag, and that's kind of what has to happen. They've been very good about, you know, looking at the buildings, and they, in the beginning, tried not to take the buildings that, you know, were in that condition. But, you know, after I left, I think there was a rehashing of how it was going to work, and they're pretty much handed everything now. So they're dealing with that. They're getting buildings that are in worse shape than they probably should be and will be, you know, here going out after all of the preventive measures that we are, you know, doing currently. And then the second part also, and I think the one that was just demoed, unless you know the address, the one that pops in my mind was on Catherine Street. That was a building that they had slated for demolition. And because the process is so long that they have to go through in order to do a planned demolition, the building just, you know, it didn't make it. And it became a imminent threat to the public health, and, you know, the building came down. So I think those are the two things kind of really what they're dealt with is the condition of the building as they're taking ownership, and then the process of the ones that they know have to go taking longer than it should be. I know we've done a few emergency demolitions. I forget what the number was. I think 6 or 7 last year, but all 7 of those were on their, you know, docket to go through the process as a planned demolition.
Okay.
I'd like to, that was very, very thorough and very helpful. My hope is that the last slides that you've got, numbers, I think they're slides 75, 76 on the starting with a vacant building registry. I think those are, to me, really the starting point for potentially some really important discussions. And I would ask if you consider another meeting where we, now understanding more of the background and the procedures, really can begin to work collaboratively with city staff and work through those items that you bulleted on those last slides. I don't think anyone knows better than you all at the city what the issues are, but I still feel that I have failed the city, that the HRC has failed the city, and frankly, that city staff has failed the city every time we lose one of these buildings. It's because it's too late. It's because we've got these other issues. It's because this, and the other, and they're very real, but we're losing buildings. And every time we lose them, we're losing more of the city's history. So if my calculations are right, I understand the financial issues, although I think it was, I think a little bit more information on how some of the community development funds that are available and how the tax credits, I mean, I think that was missing in this presentation because it can spin things in some cases a little bit differently, the view of it. But the idea that we've got a city known for its history, and out of the, I don't know, 2,900 buildings, we were able to stabilize 9 this year, and how many we've lost. And when we look that back year by year by year and forward, unless we collectively can change it, we are not doing our jobs, each of us.
Okay, let me just interrupt real quick. Of the 2,900 buildings that we talked about, those are 2,900 buildings that were cited.
Understood.
So the majority of those did not go in the route of demolition. So it's not just
understood.
we only
Yeah.
stabilized 7. That it was, I think you need to take away from that slide how many buildings, because of the citing and the intervention of Rick and his department, didn't go the route of demolition. So I think that's an
Fair
important
enough.
takeaway.
Fair enough. But I'll still go back to that every time we lose a building, we have failed. And whether it's the HRC, whether it's code enforcement, whether it's whatever the factors are, I see each of those as a failure. And when we step up and look at them collectively by year or by decade, it's a terrible disservice that we've done. But I think you've summarized in the last slides really how we can start to go about collaborating to address this situation in a more positive way. I can say only as one commission member, I certainly can't speak for anyone else, but I have felt very much outside of this process and hope that you will consider collaborating with us to help solve this. We can't just go, where do we need your help? I mean, we can't go independently and do those items, but you all are burdened with a whole other set of responsibilities and can't do some of the things that we can do. And there's a whole slew of other folks around with funding opportunities and different perspectives that are really important to the conversation. So it's a big issue, but I think it needs all of us to truly want to solve it and to do that collaboratively, because we have different strengths and different resources. So I hope this is the beginning of some real conversations and real actions, because I think you've done a great job summarizing it for us, really understand the problem, but every time we lose a building, we failed.
So
Well, let me just, I just want to jump in on that too, because, I agree. And we will work with you. We're going to bring things to you. We're going to continue to ask for people's help. But I just want to be very clear about who's failed. The number one failure on each and every one of these demolitions and each and every one of these properties is the owner of the building.
I don't know, Chris. I think maybe the failure comes
the owner of the building.
We're only starting. That's this wonderful gap now that we can address between now that the vacant building registry is active and you're making modifications to it. It's that those complaints, nothing has happened until the complaints come. And so it is that time period that you all spoke with. So the mechanism to get in there sooner that's our failure, is that we haven't collectively.
Our goal is not to continually doing stabilizations, to do interventions. Our goal is to get these properties out of the hands of people who are not good property owners, who will not do the right thing. So ultimately that would be our goal. And however that happens, obviously if people will take care of the properties, we don't have to cite them. If we cite them and they actually fix the properties, great. But if they're not going to do and the court doesn't do it, we need to get those properties away from people who have no intent of doing any work on the property, because that is the fault of the owner of the property, not the city. So we're going to continue to do everything we can to accelerate that process, to make it easier for people to climb out from underneath those properties that they don't want. But again, that's where we need the help. So Rick, you want to?
I would have just reiterated the same thing. I guess it's the word saying that the city failed when there's a demolition is not correct, because the city, as you can see through the timeline, we've done everything we're legally able to do, everything we physically are able to do. But at the end of the day, this is a personal responsibility to that building owner. If I cite you for not cleaning your yard or mowing your lawn, and you refuse to mow your lawn, that's not a failure on me. That's a failure on you for not complying and being a good steward with what's yours. So I guess it's the wording that kind of get a little defensive about. But absolutely, I think all of our efforts, whether it's a preservationist, a community member, a city staff person, all of our focus really needs to be on how do we get a property owner to be either good stewards with what they have or to get rid of it. Because, you know, we're looking at, you know, 35 emergency demolitions. I'm not including fires because those are, you know, catastrophic and you know, they're not because of neglect. But that 35 buildings out of 29,000 buildings in the city is actually pretty good. And if you look at other municipalities, our demolitions are, you know, much lower. I just think it's our focus has to be on all the preemptive measures, you know, to be here. So for instance, I say, I got a list of 1,000 vacant buildings and people just want to stand on the corner and yell at me when we're forced to do a demolition. And I say, well, where were you? You saw the building vacant. You knew the building was vacant. Why are you not so concerned, you know, 3 years ago to go after that owner to do the right thing or put the pressure on them or come up with a mechanism where it forces them to get rid of it and put it in the hands. I mean, we have some very talented and people that want to, you know, invest in the city. We got to get these buildings into the hands of those people. You know, I guess I take, you know, a defense posture when you claim it's the city's failure because of the demolition, when we've done literally everything we can legally and physically do. There's nothing else to do. Even if I pull up to that site with a truck full of money, I don't own it. I have no right to touch it. I have no right to do anything with it. That burden, that's on the owner. That's who we need to focus on, not what the city can do. What can we do to help the owner, you know, take care of their property?
I have some questions and some comments.
Thanks.
I have multiple things, but I first want to ask a point of clarification. When the stabilization was done at 19 2nd Street, who owned the property then?
Individual who was at that time living in Vermont. He's from here, but he was living in Vermont. Yes. So
was that the same individual who owned the property when you went through it with Sue Holland and saw the hole in the roof?
No, ma'am. At that time, it was owned by the county.
Okay, so it was owned by the county. So I guess my question is, multiple questions. First, I think that when you get to the point of demolition, and that's where you start talking about stabilization versus demolition, that sets up a dichotomy that is certainly challenging. The ability to do the stabilization at 19 2nd Street, if the city had been able to fix the code violation, or because I believe the city has the ability, and correct me if I'm wrong, to fix the code violation and then bill the owner for that repair. Am I incorrect in that?
Well, and part of it you are. So we have the ability and the authority to do emergency work.
Okay.
And bill the owner back for it. And I'm glad you brought this up, because that was the reasoning behind the amendment change to doing the yearly inspection. Because I knew if I could get in this building, I had no legal right to enter the person's building until the day that the wall collapsed. But if I have legal right to go in there on a yearly basis and I see that roof leak, which I saw 5 years ago when I was with the county, we have the ability and the authority. If the owner did not take care of that roof leak, we can put the roof on there, and that's a much easier bill for the owner to swallow and, you know, reimburse us for than that. So that was actually the main reason I wanted to get in the building on a yearly basis, is because so you didn't have rights inside before that.
So to clarify the city's process moving forward, let's pretend you were inspecting 19 2nd Street in a month. You have this history. You would then be able to continually cite the building owner and then go in and make that repair. Is that what I would just heard?
Exactly correct.
Okay, because that of course, that's what we're trying to Marilyn's point about how can we move forward without litigating the past. I think that is a really key component, and I think you know, it's great that that work was done on 19 Street, but that was a pretty extraordinarily comprehensive stabilization that many of us who've been around vacant buildings have seen buildings stabilized without needing quite that level of intervention. So I think that that's great to hear. So another couple things, in terms of those stabilization proposals, looking at the cost, when you're doing those questions about, so for Eagle Street or for 2nd Street, is the city seeking multiple bids and multiple proposals on that stabilization? Are you just talking to Russ? Are you doing a quick, okay, 3 engineers, give me your stabilization proposal for cost estimate, or are you just going with 1 engineer on that?
We can only go with the 1 engineer at that point, because from the time that the determination is that the stabilization or the demolition has to happen, we are on a time frame of 24 hours of removing the hazard. So yes, we deal with the 1 engineer that we call for that particular project and go on. And again, well, I won't beat a dead horse, but yeah.
So the
Again,
time frame of,
same thing with just so you know, when they're doing the stabilization, just as the demolition, the qualified contractors are already there. The ones that can do that have the equipment, that are demolition contractors. Same thing. They are open bids right there, then and there. So there's not. It's a competitive bidding process on those.
the time frame of assessing the emergency, and I want to clarify, there is a difference. There's 100, you had 171 unsafe buildings categorized as unsafe, but then 79 emergency action. So am I correct in understanding that the unsafe category is different from the emergency action category?
Well, yeah, so the 171, was that the number
Yeah.
on there? So that was where we saw structural deficiencies that needed to be addressed, you know, a foundation starting to cave or whatever it might be. That's where we cited the owner and said, we are putting the burden on you, which we do on every one of them. We put the burden on the owner to get the engineer to have their own assessment, and then they have to make the repairs based on that engineer's report. Where the emergency action had to take place are the folks that did not comply to that. And we went through, you know, and they were all in court. So we had cited them, told them we wanted the engineer's report. They did not get us one. We're going through the court process. We've, you know, sent them, we had to go back for the reinspection, send them to prosecution, they get the et cetera. But in that short time frame is when it, you know, for whatever reason, we're back in there having to take emergency action.
So if you're going through that emergency action process that you just described, it sounds like you know more than 24 hours in advance that a property is going to be an emergency situation, which I think comes back to that stabilization proposal.
Now, again,
Okay, so in 24 hours, you're doing all of those things?
So 171 were unsafe, unfit. Those are ones where it was not an emergency action. So
Understood.
there's time for them to get in their engineer. Oftentimes, when we get to the site, there isn't that option for them to fix it themselves or get their own engineer. There may be a building owner who lives down in Brooklyn, and he wants to get his own engineer. And if his engineer can be there within an hour or so and give us a report, and they have contractors, then they can do it themselves. But otherwise, it comes upon us to take care of that problem within the time frame. So a lot of times there are those engineer reports that the property can be addressed, but it's not necessarily a public health hazard where the building's going to fall over the street. So those are a little bit different than the ones where emergency action has to be taken.
Right, I understood that. I thought I was hearing Rick say that there was a process for the emergency action, but I guess I misunderstood that. Because it used to be that if something was investigated, inspected, and deemed an emergency, there was an opportunity to go and take a look at it. And it would seem that would invite an opportunity to have multiple people provide their feedback on the stabilization. Is that 24 hours? Is that a state regulation that if it's deemed an emergency, it must be acted upon inside of 24 hours?
Correct. So, and I just want to make sure we're clear. So out of the ones that we, deemed unsafe, unfit, and required the engineer's report, and then they were in some sort of, court action, it could be 9 months or 10 months from the time we cited them and saw it to the time that it became an emergency because it was it became that active. Once I am on scene, once it, rises to the level where there's some kind of active movement, the wall collapsed, something happened, and I end up on scene, and I call the engineer. It's from the time the engineer deems it critical that the time starts ticking. We're not in a position to be, say, oh, we're not going to go with your assumption. We're going to call in 2 more engineers. In fact, the very first call we do is, if we have it, is we call the owner, and we try to put the onus on them. We say, we're at your building. We're doing it as we speak. We're at your building. We need an engineer here immediately. And if we can't get them or they can't provide one, then we call one off of our list. But yeah, once it's been determined, we don't then second guess that engineer. That's why we have the engineer. We're not going to then say, well, we think maybe we could do this some other way. It's not my call. I'm not the engineer, and that's why we have a qualified engineer on our list.
Okay, and my question was mostly and I just want to make sure I'm understanding the numbers. So of the 171 unsafe, 79 complied, 92 went to court. So then those 79 emergency action properties are 79 properties that were part of those 92 that went to court, or are those 79 emergency action properties separate? Are those 2 numbers, is one inside the others? Are those a Venn diagram?
Yeah, so again, it's not always a direct correlation. So the 171 or 191, each one of those is not necessarily correlated to one of the 79 where emergency action was taken. So some of those that were cited as unsafe, unfit, 9 months ago, doesn't mean that those ones necessarily go to the emergency. So there are emergency actions taken on buildings that never sort of illustrated to anyone before that there was an issue. Suddenly there was a catastrophic collapse inside the building that we didn't know that there was an internal leak. And that's the first we've heard of it. And that's going direct to emergency action versus going through the unsafe, unfit.
Correct. Yep.
Okay.
So it can happen. It can happen either way, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It could
Okay.
migrate to that process, or it could all of a sudden suddenly illustrate to us that emergency action has to be taken.
Okay, just a couple more. I'm going to try to get through this quickly. The land bank, you mentioned that the land bank had already slated Catherine Street for demolition. I don't believe that any land bank demolition list that included Catherine Street came before the Historic Resources Commission. So I'm wondering, is there a land bank demolition list that the city knows of, that the HRC doesn't know of, if it's in a historic district? And along those lines, if we're saying that it's the property incumbent upon the property owner to fix it, I guess there's an interest. The land bank is a really missing piece here, and we want to make sure that, personally speaking as a commissioner, I want to make sure that we can support the land bank. And if they're having trouble finding resources to stabilize really significant, important federal properties in a historic district like Catherine Street, how can we work with them to give them the resources so that they can stabilize those properties and prevent demolition?
Sure.
Because in that instance, the land bank was the owner, and if it's incumbent upon the owner to stabilize the buildings, they didn't do that.
Again, I think, reaching out to the land bank, finding out which other properties that they have that are critical properties within historic districts, and then having that conversation with them. Again, they try to triage everything coming in the door. They look at which ones they think are going to be candidates for demolition. That doesn't mean they've necessarily made that determination or taken action to start that process of doing that review. Then there are other ones that they feel are good candidates for stabilization, but that also doesn't mean that by the time they are able to take that action to stabilize, that those buildings aren't in a further state of flux, where they may have to take some action. So again, the fact that they may have a list of ones that they think are going to be candidates for demolition does not necessarily mean that we have that list that they say these are our applications for demolition.
I've
So-
never seen a list. That was just verbalized.
But again,
to me.
that's something that,
That's-
I think is a conversation we can have with the land bank in terms of, where are they? What are the properties that they consider very vulnerable to that, and try to get more eyes on that. But again, they have they're doing their own inspections, they're doing their own look at these properties. And, frankly, if they're doing that, we're going to try not to duplicate what they're doing. We just want to make sure that there aren't any gaps.
So I as a commissioner, I would really love to engage with the land bank. I think it might be helpful to have a better understanding of how the land bank figures this out. I think that the Catherine Street demolitions were a real wake-up call, and I think that it'd be helpful to have that conversation through the Historic Resources Commission.
And I think that's a perfect way of going about it. And I think, Aaron, you could probably facilitate that, inviting Adam or Amanda to the HRC to sort of talk about how they've triaged their buildings, which ones they think, do they have an active list, and allow you guys the opportunity to ask as many of those kind of questions that that you may have, and also to provide some insight in terms of where they might be able to get more funding to do some of these stabilizations.
We've done that in the past, and we can definitely do it again at some point to have them come in and do a presentation to the commission.
Right.
Well, I'd like to
One
take
more
it
point on the legislation. It's great to see those bullets and what the city's working towards. Personally, I'd love to see what we can do to help, speaking with my Preservation League hat somewhat on here. I've talked to Sam Wells about some of that, but please, as the city looks at legislation, please consider the Preservation Community Resources, because this is the first I've heard about some of these things, and I haven't heard a lot about progress on the others. So, and also, of course, there's the John McDonald's receivership bill that's out right now. So, I think you asked for help from the preservation community, and I want to reiterate that it's certainly out there, especially from your statewide organization. So,
Great, thanks.
please
appreciate
use
that.
us and consider us a resource.
Will
That's it.
do.
Thank you.
What did the preservation, maybe this is a question for Aaron Glennon, what did the preservation plan, what were kind of some, I didn't look back or should have, what direct us in terms of these conversations around the vacant buildings?
Right. One of the things that we've kind of already taken a stab at, and John and I have been working on this, we had the meeting back in January, was the emergency demolition notification process, which sets up a procedure for notifying the HRC when an emergency demolition is taking place. Sam Wells and I have also been looking at resources that the city already has as an early warning detection program that kind of helps us, see buildings that have either been vacant for a number of years or that are just coming online as vacant, kind of giving us a warning system that, they've been vacant for 15 years. It doesn't look like we've had any response from property owners that this may be a building that is coming forward as may come forward as a demolition at some point, and helping us be able to catch these buildings much earlier. So we're using a program currently that we have. Hopefully we can set parameters that will work and send us notifications of that. And then also, I know that Kara Macri has talked about this, working with the land bank, but kind of creating a marketing system for the city's vacant buildings, being able to work with the land bank to work with their inventory to kind of market those and get those into the hands of people that will, responsibly rehab properties. So there's a number of different action items within the plan that speak to vacancy and demolition. So
The early warning piece feels like really a thread that I've heard from the first comment to my own is that really feels like how we can get ahead of it. And I guess, again, I hope we have more working conversations about this. I really, truly do. But the vacant building registry and some of the changes that Rick spoke of, and probably what else didn't quite get in there yet, or what you, Rick, already know is the next step. I think all of that folds together in terms of early warning, which is a constant threat and thread.
Well, and the early warning is an opportunity for us to, assist where we can and influence some outcomes. And since the land bank is one of the largest property owners by default of some of the most vulnerable properties, because they inherit what the county doesn't want, working closely with the land bank to assist them in doing their assessments, so that using us as a resource and as an aid and an ally in what they're trying to do and what we're trying to do with the vacant building ordinance and these annual inspections to triage buildings and understand which ones are vulnerable and which actions can be taken in a cost-effective manner to save them, and not let them slide down this path of ultimate demolition.
I think it takes all of us. I think it takes a lot of creativity and collaboration, and it will take all of us to make change here. Yeah.
I have one more question. This is not about a locally designated set of buildings, but it is about a National Register eligible set of buildings, and that's the recent demolition in Sheridan Hollow at Elk and Spruce, where it was a cascading demolition, and certainly had a property owner interested in rehabilitation had gone to the State Preservation Office, gotten National Register eligibility. Now that potential historic district is in jeopardy because of the demolition. And I'm wondering if the city could speak to what exactly happened there, because I witnessed the demolition. So how did that happen?
Well, it happened from years of neglect. So even though the property owner expressed interest in doing all these things, he's had that building for a number of years and did absolutely zero to make it watertight. There were large sections of roof that were gone and collapsing. There were, talk about multiple collapse zones. Our intent was only to deal with the county building, which is what kind of instigated that whole thing. And and I gotta tell you, the building that's left standing, I think everybody should be putting all their resources into figuring out how that gets saved, because it's probably not too far behind where those other ones are. I mean, there was so much danger in that building, so many roof collapses. There was one section with a 40-foot wall on the, was it the Spruce? Is that Spruce Street side? That the roof had collapsed, a large section of roof had collapsed, which went a few floors down. The remaining roofing structure that was left somewhat intact had disengaged from that building and was literally pushing the top of that 40-foot section. If it had dropped, it would have dropped it into Spruce Street. So, and just so you know, some backstory, I did a little bit of a walkthrough of that building a couple of months ago with the owner, and saw, I'll back up. We were called to that building a couple of months ago when very large sections of glass block were falling into the sidewalk and into the street. It was unreal how much debris was in the street. And I met the owner there with his engineer, and was really surprised because I had never been in the building before, so I wasn't aware of all the issues. And we required him to conduct an emergency stabilization of his own building. His engineer designed it and stabilized the front. And I said to him, I'm gonna go through our natural process, even though, I probably could have forced our hand in there a little sooner, but I really wanted to help Dino, get that building secured so that he could go through with whatever plans he had. In the course of 30 to 45 days, and I had given him the notice of violation, said, and his engineer was there, he knew what we needed to do. I said, you need to come up with some scope to stabilize what's happening in here. I said, because it's going to become a public health hazard, very rapidly. So fast forward, after we had that conversation, I cited him. And by the way, I never got the engineer's report, and he never did any of the work that they verbalized they were going to do. The county building began to collapse, and actually did collapse inside of itself. And, in the back of my mind, I knew what I had seen in Dino's, but I wasn't over there. I'm in the county building. And so we were dealing with just the county building. The contractor, they had the county engineer there, declared his own building. We bid it out. The contractor starts the demolition and gets about halfway into the building. And now they can, because they couldn't get physically back there before, because everything had collapsed in on itself. Now that they're in there, they see that an enormous portion of Dino's building had collapsed, and the contractor had to stop their demolition because, it was just unknown. So we had to call in. So in a matter of 35 days with even Dino's engineer, significant portions of that building had collapsed that were not collapsed when I was in there 30 days sooner. So it was much more active and much worse than as bad as it was, to where it is. So that was what led us there and got us there. And, every section of that building had very large collapses inside of there. And quite frankly, the ability to save the facades to help, because we believe me, we spent many hours trying to figure out how can we save the front of the buildings to help. They told us that if the facades were there, at least they could move forward with this projected project. The second portion of the roof structure was removed, the entire building, the entire facade fell into the street that night. So that put the end of us even contemplating trying to, because our directive was, we're going to save it, get the damaged section out, pull it out, get it down, and we'll come up with a way to stabilize the facades. But it just wasn't feasible, it wasn't possible, and it wasn't safe to send anybody inside there to even try to manipulate anything, because the risk was a wall coming down on top of somebody. So believe me, it hurt everybody in this room, that went the way it went. And that's why I say the remaining portion of that building, is quite frankly in jeopardy as well. And I'm hoping,
That's okay.
so I'm hoping Dino continues to move on with that, because our violations still stand for that property and what we're requiring him, but we still have not received any engineering and plan on how he's going to stabilize the portion of that building that has issues.
You're talking about the taller building that's right up against the viaduct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. There's a building on Spruce Street there, and I looked at the aerial. It didn't look like it was tied into any of the other larger building that fronted on Elk. It looked like there was a standalone building on Spruce that was perhaps more tied into the remaining building. And I'm sorry, my dog is barking. But that's part of it. And I don't want to get too into it because I know we're short on time and I want to make sure everybody has time to talk. But I wanted to bring that up as a question because it seemed like it was a little bit outside of the process that you had been describing previous, or in your presentation.
It was actually right in line with it. We mandated the engineer's reports, never got them. The other emergency demolition of the county building that we had not been in or had any, inkling of what was going on, is what precipitated all of that, you know. The rest of it was as, you know, status quo. We don't waver from the process.
Rick, you're pretty close to all these. What's kind of the next feasible set of tools or people or actions that you need?
Well, and again, and by the way, I thank you for offering, you know, collaborating and stuff, and I will take you up on that 1,000%. And I can talk about this stuff all night
Well, that's
long.
after I blamed you for all the like.
Well, it's okay. Listen, I got big shoulders. I'm not.
And I meant to take them.
Injury.
I feel them very personally, my own. But anyway, yeah.
So the quite frankly, the things that I really need to happen is, well, there's two, is the judicial system portion of it. So for instance, when I send you to court for not complying to the violations that got you in court, and then the judge, you get in front of the judge and the judge says, oh, okay, here's a $100 fine or even $1,000 fine. You pay the fine, you're on your way. There's no mandate coming from the judge saying, oh, by the way, you got to pay this fine, but you still have to comply. And because of that, we have to relitigate. We have to start all over. And this happens over and over. And quite frankly, the repeat offenders know the game.
Right.
So they know, we'll pay the fine and we'll see you in 6 months kind of thing. So that really needs to be tightened up.
So ideally, the fines would continue to accumulate and continue to escalate until the judges got something from the city saying that they have complied with all the conditions that got them in the court in the first place. So those are, I think, would be one way to consider a change.
Yep. So then the second thing that we're actively trying to get our hands around and figure out the best way to handle it is, you know, the amendment change. And quite frankly, the amendment change that we did last summer, I honestly believe when it's, you know, fully operating and happening in 3 years, and I say it's probably less, but in 3 years, I believe we're not standing at another emergency demolition by neglect. I honestly believe that. I think there's so many proactive measures from the amendment to the monies we received in the city's RISE program, the drone for the roof. There's so many things we're doing proactively that have never been done in the city, ever, period. So I think we are really turning that corner. But the second part of this is that amendment where I now need to get in that vacant building once a year when you register is awesome. But out of that 1,000 buildings, only 200 people comply. So I have 800 buildings that are not complying, not registering, and we're not getting inside, and we don't have the legal right to go in there. So what my hope is, and we haven't gotten to a point yet where we're playing it out, is that when that person is in court for non-compliance, that the judge then grants us a warrant or gives us the ability to enter that structure, because all of these demolitions can be diverted and not happen if we're in there sooner, taking care of the things that led up to that demolition, which, like I said, was probably 90% water. So any help that we can get where we can get legal avenues into a property, again, people have rights and I totally respect that. But when we're talking about life safety, because quite frankly, I believe the city has been very fortunate that we haven't had a catastrophic event where someone's been killed by a building. I mean, I'm in every one of these buildings, and I full-heartedly believe at some point one of these buildings is going to come down when we're not standing there, and it's going to be devastating. So everything everything we do, everything we plan for is in preparation and trying to get out in front of these things. So
What level of government are those, those two items that you just spoke of, which both kind of have judges and legislation? What levels of government are those?
So it's the city court that, you know, has the jurisdiction to say, so my plan is, and I just haven't gotten with all the courts shut down, we haven't gotten there yet, but we have some people that are technically in court for non-compliance. And my hope is that we're going to go after a warrant to enter those premises to do the inspection based on the fact there's too many unknowns and it could be a life safety issue. So, and again, I don't know how HRC specifically helps with that, but that's the help that I'm trying to get, you know, garner support for and help for, because, you know, quite frankly, the things we're doing in the city of Albany and after getting this grant and I've worked with these other 9 municipalities over the state, we're the only ones with a vacant building registry. We're the only ones conducting ROP inspections. We are the only ones out doing preemptive inspections for code violations. So even though we look at it as we got so far to go, we're real, you know, we are blessed to be so far ahead. So
Yes.
I try not to lose sight of that, but this is my passion. I hope, you know, that comes out here, but, you know, vacant buildings and quality of life issues is an extreme passion of mine.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Are there any other comments from commission members before we turn to the audience?
I'll say something, John.
Thank you.
I mean, there is a difference between emergency demolition and a planned demolition. I'm curious, is it a requirement of the land bank to file for a demolition permit? And does a city engineer question their engineer at all in our historic districts?
So for a planned demolition, they would have to go through the process. So if it's in a historic district, they're going to come before the HRC. If it's not, they'll go before the planning board. So they'll go through the process. They'll have to get demolition permits from the city of Albany. They'll have to file all the Department of Health and Department of Labor. They'll have to do all the monitoring. They'll have to do all the abatement that's required. For an emergency, it's going to be, you know, again, we are not, you know, typically when we look at those emergency demolitions, there really is not a lot of questions in terms of whether a second engineer is going to come in and say, no, it doesn't have to come down. So
Well, I understand a planned
yeah,
demolition.
we've been in enough of them and seen enough of them that, you know, again, we're not questioning neither Rick or I are engineers, so we are not going to question another engineer that has a license, that has a stamp, that is qualified to do that and make those assessments.
But could there be some kind of a process where once you received a demolition or they filed for a demolition permit, you in turn could share that with the HRC rather than us complicating things with the land bank and asking them, what are you looking to demo? I mean, it seems odd.
Yeah, but I mean, again, once they filed for a demolition permit, they're going to either be in front of the HRC or the planning board. So these are, you know, all within our website. It's on a public, you know, domain. So there's not like there's a secret list at that point. So once they've filed and once they have an application with the city, it's right on our website. So it should be easily garnered information if that's what you need. You want us to, you know, Aaron, to kind of scour through the non-historic district demolition permit applications that are going before the planning board. She could easily do that and just, you know, provide that information filtered out for you.
And I mean, all
Give
demolitions,
it more work.
all planned demolitions in the city of Albany go through a review board. So those within historic districts are going before the Historic Resource Commission. Properties outside of historic districts are going through the planning board demolition review. So, you know, and that's for private property owners as well as county-owned buildings.
So, and Rick, do you want to just talk real briefly about a project that for a planned demolition, how that goes through your department once it's been approved by the planning board or the HRC?
Yeah, so once it's been approved for a planned demolition, you know, the incident command is not necessary or anything like that. But they do have to follow, all demolitions have to follow the Department of Labor guidelines. And we don't oversee that. So that's up to the qualified contractor doing the demolition. You know, we make sure that whoever's applying has the appropriate licenses and insurances, et cetera. So, you know, we're not on scene during those demolitions, and we don't oversee the physical demolition of it at that point. It's just all, you know, it's status quo for any of these guys that are in that business.
A planned demolition can turn into an emergency demolition quite quickly. You gave a whole bunch of examples early on.
It could. I haven't seen one that's gone that way. I'm not aware of any planned demolitions that went. Oh,
Yeah, he's talking about something
I'm sorry.
where
Yeah, I got you.
The 16 Eagles.
somebody
I
may
see
have
what you're
gotten,
saying.
they may have gotten approval from the planning board and they have not finished that demolition or gotten to the demolition and then it became an emergency. That could certainly happen. Yeah, so,
Sorry, I misunderstood your question. I apologize.
It's all right. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
All right. Aaron, do we want to consider taking questions from the public?
I have one member of the public with their hand raised. Up, there's two. So Tom, we will start with you. If you would like to
You could
comment
state
or question.
your name and
You have,
Am I on?
you are on, Tom.
Oh,
Yep.
thank you.
3 minutes.
My name is Tom McFeeters. I live on Wilbur Street. Last time you folks saw me, I was with a bunch of residents of the South End begging you to tear down a building on Alexander and Elizabeth Street. It took another 6 months for that building to go down, but everybody was very happy that it did. I don't live in the heart of the South End, but I've been working there for 10 years, and I think somebody really needs to speak for these neighborhoods and these neighbors who are really besieged by the blight that these vacant buildings create. This is sort of a broken record with me. You've heard this before, but I just think that there needs to be that perspective in your consideration. What I would advocate for, and first of all, let me just say that I am very impressed with the progress that the city, Rick Rajoy, Sam Wells, and all the rest of you have made in the last year or so, or maybe 2 years, to try and get a handle on this whole situation. But what really needs to happen is an overall assessment of all the vacant buildings in the concentrated areas where they exist. And I only know about the South End, but I'm sure it's very true of Arbor Hill, West Hill, and so on. Mm-hmm. There needs to be an assessment of every one of these that looks at not only their condition, but their future viability. And I hate to say it to all you preservationists, there needs to be a lot more demolition going on right now. Now, I know that's a very expensive proposition, but if that were done in a strategically selected area, and one obvious one right now is the area where the land bank is looking to bring a developer in to develop their clusters up near 2nd Avenue. But I'm sure that's not the only one. If that were done, the return on the city, I'm sure would be tenfold, because you would start to see new investment. You would start to see investment in the buildings that are savable and so on. So I think there's been some good work done, but I think the perspective of really looking at the neighborhoods, considering the impact that these buildings have on their lives, their health, their mental health, their public safety, all of these things, is just not being considered certainly not by the Historic Resources Commission. I know you wear a different hat, and I don't think it's being considered enough by the city as well. I think there needs to be a shift in focus so that the neighborhoods really get the focus. Thank you.
thank you.
yeah, thanks, Tom. I just want to respond real quick because I think, those are important points. They are things that we do consider when we think about not just those buildings themselves, but redevelopment potential, or properties that are so far gone that there is no viability in them. But part of the problem we have is, number one, we don't own them, so we can't just go in and tear them down. We could take them through eminent domain, in which case we would not only have to pay the property owner, we would also have to pay for the demolition. So that becomes expensive. But I think part of the idea is, again, getting these properties away from owners who are going to do nothing with them. So if we can get those properties where there may be 2 or 3 in a row that really have no viability into the hands of somebody who might redevelop those 2 or 3 lots, that's a great opportunity. And there's a little bit of economies of scale when you have a couple of them near each other. Again, there are a lot of properties that meet those conditions, but then there are, again, a lot of properties that we really want to put on our radar and do everything we can to try to save them. So we've got to look at it from both angles there. But again, it's, there are these properties that we do not own, and we do not want to own that bill for the demolition either. But I think one thing that you point out, and there are some pretty good stats, and we could probably put something together with Sam Wells, is the return on sort of the public safety where some of those problem properties have been demolished. So the reduction in police calls for a number of issues is pretty astounding when you chart those out. So there are a lot of those properties that are just complete magnets for illicit activity. And once those properties are removed, those calls go right away, and some of those problems, at least in that particular location, disappear.
I'd like to suggest that even though I think absolutely one needs to be responsive, and the community and the neighborhood voices are paramount, that I don't think it's a two-choice proposition of leave a building vacant or demolish it. And I think that there could be strategic investment, which we've seen other cities make, where there is investment in rehabilitation of existing buildings, using the available incentives, and perhaps partnering rehabilitation with existing buildings, with new construction. So I think the South End is a very good example where there are pockets of vacant buildings that do have some kind of a municipal hook, whether it's the city, county, or land bank. And there are also a lot of vacant lots. And I think putting together a thoughtful package where it's not, let's demolish an entire block and put up cookie cutter construction that's going to fall apart in a number of years, just like a lot of the new affordable housing construction has needed investment, like the South Pearl Street buildings, for example, with the brick that kept falling off about 10, 15 years ago. So let's make smart investments in our existing vacant buildings that can be rehabilitated, and be thoughtful, and see how we can partner that with new construction to make it viable for housing developers.
Yeah, I think the land bank is trying to do some of that in the South End with some of their clusters, is to look at the clusters of vacant buildings, and also to try to put together proposals, or at least accept proposals for projects that will look at those vacant structures, but also integrate a number of existing buildings and rehab those buildings. So I think there's some of that work that continues, but I think there's there are certainly projects where there's a possibility to do both the new construction, rehabilitation, but also some selective demolition, where some of these properties are just in a state where they're just not going to be viable in any manner. So I think there's all of those conditions existing throughout the South End, throughout the West Hill End, and throughout areas of Arbor Hill.
Great. Bill, Brenda, you have 3 minutes. Bill? Bill?
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Okay.
3 minutes.
Yes, I could talk for more than 3 minutes. But anyway, I'm not going to go over that. I think the progress that's been made is tremendous. I think the overarching issue is, and it gets to Tom McFeeder's point, there's never been a plan in the city of Albany. There's never been a large-scale assessment. I understand the reasons that that's difficult, but Chris Spencer pointed out what I think is the overarching reason that needs to happen is the cost savings of bundling demolitions that would then allow for money to go into things like early intervention that Rick is talking about. For example, a roof costs $20,000. They were talking about Second Street costing $65,000 to tear it down. Those early interventions can have an incredible impact on the city. And I totally understand what Tom's talking about with not ignoring the neighborhoods, but at the same time, right now we've had for 20, 25 years, a process where there's absolutely no public input whatsoever. We're starting to get it here, like these discussions now. But sharing the engineers' reports seems like a no-brainer. Those are public documents. I think they my reading of the HRC ordinance is they should be shared with the HRC. And if it's not in a historic district, it should be shared with the planning board, because I really think we need to have in the city of Albany a bit more of the group think, but also the process of peer review. Russ did an excellent summation of the work that was done on 19 2nd Street, but Aaron Tobin, I think I saw where you were going. Some of that seemed a bit overkill. I'm not saying it is, because I couldn't read every word on all of those sheets, but I think a lot of that stuff doesn't get looked into. And if that price, instead of being 164,000, could have been 122,000, there's not that big a difference between the 122 and the 65 when you can 65,000. When you consider at the end of the day, you have a building, an essentially new building, a shell, but a new building with a new roof. That's really worthwhile investment. And that's why I think we need to have a strategic plan for dealing with vacant and abandoned buildings in the city, where there's a group looking at all of those components, not just the minutia. And there needs to be a public process, because the fact that we've been doing this for 20, 25 years and there's no public oversight is not, I don't understand why it's acceptable to anybody. But anyway, that's my 3 minutes. Thanks, guys.
All right, thanks, Bill. I just want to address a couple points real quick. First of all, even if we brought the cost of stabilization down, and the difference was between 65 and 120 versus 164, there's a difference, right? And that's where I'm saying we don't have the funds to bridge those gaps in general. And certainly, I'm going to let Russ talk a little bit about whether, in fact, the work that was done there was overkill, because I think I'm not an engineer, and it's very easy to pretend you're an engineer, but I think it's important to listen to an engineer who's actually done the calculations and understands the loads and understands all of the conditions. So I'm going to go ahead and let Russ respond to that real quick.
Thank you, Bill. This is Russ. Let me share a thought, if I may. A lot of the buildings we stabilize are 130, 140 years old, and it's very easy when you begin to manipulate the structure to have it destabilize. Over the years, we developed a methodology in which we prepare these stabilizations, but we also show how we get from point A to B. The format we use is extremely thorough, and we've had tremendous success with that. Many times our work, and the reason we took that methodology, many times our work is reviewed by other professionals. And that's why we have developed that format. Matter of fact, I should point out that 19 2nd Street, for example, and other buildings we stabilized, we were asked by the New York State Society of Professional Engineers to provide a class in building stabilization, which we had done. That what we prepared was actually reviewed by a peer 7 other professional engineers who look for projects, look for presentations where other professionals can get professional development hours. And they utilized our work that we've done, including 19 2nd Street, for professional development hours that other professional engineers got credit for, that we present. So what we did for 19 2nd Street, that was very successful. The 3 walls that remained could have easily destabilized. The methodology we took prevented that. So while we show a very thorough methodology, we did it. It was successful. It could have taken a left turn. It didn't. We've done other buildings, other types of structures in this manner. We're working not only on building structures, but the Troy seawall, for example, which is 100 years old. So the point I'm trying to make is that format, I've been doing this for 37 years, and that format has been massaged and developed over the years, and our peers find it to be acceptable to the point where we give a class in that to other professional engineers for credit.
I just want to make a comment real quick that we will only be allowing one 3-minute comment period per attendee this evening. So if you do have any further questions or comments and you've already spoken tonight, please feel free to email any further questions to hrc@albanyny.gov. Are there any other comments from the public who've not already spoken? All right. I'm not seeing anything else, so any other comments from any of the members of the commission?
No, I'm good. Thank you very much for making me understand some things I did not understand before.
All right, thank you. Thanks for joining us.
All right, I will.
Yeah, thank you very, very much.
Yes.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to Chris, Rick, Russ, and Barb for your presentation and all your work in the efforts of triaging buildings and saving them to the extent that it's possible. And we look forward to future opportunities to work with you and also be advocates for the items that you have suggested in your slide presentation. And if we can advocate to the courts to speed up the process, then we certainly would encourage that as well. So I see a lot of letter writing coming up in the very near future.
Thank you.
I will entertain a motion to adjourn if everyone is amenable to that.
So moved.
And a
I
second.
make a motion to adjourn. Second.
All right. We have a motion and a second. All those in favor, wave.
Aye.
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 Okay.
You will.
Well, I guess we are officially adjourned then. Thank you all for our
Have a good night.
world of meetings.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you.
Be well, everyone.
All right. Have a good night.
Thank you.
You
You too.
will.
Yeah, we're losing them fast here. All right. Good night, Aaron.
Good night, John. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.